Alrighty, so moving on here. Sorry, it's just a little tricky with a couple of these PowerPoints. Moving on to the third PowerPoint slide for our discussion here. And we just finished talking about the end of the Kennedy presidency. Of course, it was this shocking, profound moment in U.S. history. And now we have a brand new president. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, totally different background than Kennedy, about 10 years older, 10 to 12 years older than Kennedy, and from Texas. He came from he's one of the poorest backgrounds of any person who ever became president, came from very humble origins in the Texas Hill Country. He was a Texas Democrat. In many ways, he was sort of the polar opposite of John F. Kennedy. And he made himself a whole political career. He started in the Texas House of Representatives, then he moved into the Senate, and was one of the most effective legislators. Had a huge career in the Senate before finally agreeing to become vice president in the 1960 Democratic ticket. There was some concern about that, especially from Kennedy loyalists who did not want LBJ to be on the ticket, but they thought it would maybe be a good match and that he would help possibly bring in Texas, which he did in the election of 1960. And of course, then he finds himself just 3.5 years later, the president of the United States. And after the Kennedy assassination, he takes the oath of office on Air Force One on the ground in Texas, and now he's the leader of the free world, quote, in moving from November 1963 forward. So. What he does is he creates a very ambitious program using his very skillful lobbying with Congress. He was probably the most well-connected president with the Congress ever. So he had tons of old contacts. He, of course, himself had been a representative, a member of the House, and then a member of the Senate. He did this thing called the Johnson treatment, where he would stand next to another person in Congress and talk to them really loudly and hover over them. He was very tall and sort of intimidated them, and it was very effective. Probably wouldn't work today in the same ways. But he was very, very effective with this lobbying, with his political connections, and the lifelong political sort of relationship that he had connected to on Capitol Hill for several decades through the 1940s and 50s that served him very well once he got into the presidency. Remember, the House and the Senate were Democratic majorities at this point, so he also had that going for him. So he creates a series of programs, much like FDR created the New Deal. He wasn't dealing with an economic depression in the same ways, but he's going to create a series of really powerful and important programs, the first of which become sort of connected to ideas related to this war on poverty, where he attempted through the federal government and through legislation and through being a relatively activistic president, attempting to create a series of policies to help alleviate issues of socioeconomic distress and issues of class difference and economic disparity that existed very clearly in the United States in 1965, or the period around 1965. So the first program, these are programs that we accept today that were somewhat controversial when they were created, but have become accepted, very important programs that all Americans have access to, or most Americans have access to. The first of which is Medicare, a program that developed federal aid to the elderly for medical expenses. And of course, I think most people know that you are eligible for Medicare, I think, when you turn 65, right? There's a whole set, there's different forms of it, Medicare A, Medicare B. But basically, it's a form of health insurance for people who are no longer working, usually, and people who are retired. And it gives them access through the help of the federal government for a series of medical expenses, which can often be quite high for elderly people. Once you get older. And so Medicare is pushed through. Medicaid is also pushed through the very next year. So Medicare is from 1965. Medicaid is from 1966, as you can see here on the slide. And Medicaid extended federal medical assistance to people who were on receiving government support, people who were on, quote, welfare, people who were unable to work, people who were disabled and unable to work for a variety of reasons, both mental and health issues of physical disabilities. And so Medicare and Medicaid are these important programs pushed through from the federal government that allow for degrees of medical care and medical support for people who are on the margins of society, both in terms of age or in terms of being economically dispossessed or dealing with a variety of issues related to disabilities. So very, very important, and those programs received pushback, but they have become very ingrained now, and over 50 years later, 55 years later, nobody would dream of trying to, most people, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, what party they're in, or left or right, would attempt to get rid of them. Most likely. So those are the issues that start off this, quote, war on poverty. And then Johnson turned his focus onto issues related to education. There's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Very important educational component to the Great Society. Johnson has a very problematic presidency, and we'll talk about some of the issues at the end. But in terms of what he did on the domestic home front, it's very, very strong. And I'm going to make a couple of points here. I tend to try hard to be relatively neutral in how I present history, even though, of course, I have my own beliefs and my own ideology and my own political beliefs very strongly, of course. And they have their way that they, of course, come into the way that I present the material, because, of course, no matter how much anyone attempts to be neutral, you're incapable of escaping all of your biases and all of your own internalized understandings of things. But I do want to stress how important I think LBJ's presidency was on the educational front, because it's central to sort of transforming the experience of education for people, especially for people who were not wealthy in the second half of the 20th century and the first half of the 21st century that we're already into. And so I'll talk about a couple of those themes and why I think so highly about these programs that he pushed forward. All right, so the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 came from the Department of Education and from that part of the Johnson administration. It was pushed into law in April of 1965. It was basically began the process of providing significant federal aid in public education. Up to this point, all of education was funded from taxes from the state level or from city or municipality or county levels. So if you lived in an area that had a much lower tax base, that was a much poorer area, your access to high-level education, just in terms of for construction of buildings, for access to textbooks, to ability to pay teachers and administrative staff, was much more compromised. Your access to education was much less, and quality education, depending on through the quirk of where you grew up or what part of the state that you lived in of your particular state. So it begins the process of providing significant federal aid to public education. Initially, it allotted more than $1 billion, which today sounds like not a lot of money considering how much we're throwing around the billions and the trillions these days. But it was tremendously effective. Helped schools purchase materials, helped start a series of education programs, particularly the development of special education programs. It helped specifically low-income children to have a greater access to and exposure to higher quality education. Doesn't solve all the problems, certainly, but it helps move in the right direction. One part of this is it helped start this program that was known as Head Start, which had originally started as an 8-week summer program coming out of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act into the summer of 1965, and then they decided to keep it going. And this program still exists to this day. Perhaps some of you experienced it, and that was allowing for federally funded preschool program for people who qualified from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And so it basically allowed for a head start for children who did not have as much access to education, came from poor families or more economically marginalized families. huge role in that program, Head Start. There's been certain times when people have tried to cut it down and to get rid of it, but it has continued all the way into the present day and has become a permanent program and a fixture on the federal level from the Department of Education, coming out of the Elementary and Secondary School Education Act of 1965. The other act that I want you to, there's a couple other that he gets involved in. Also was a part of this bilingual education that starts at the very end of his term in 1968, and beginning to offer money to allow school districts to offer educational translations of things into different languages and the needs of children who had limited English speaking ability. That actually started in 1968. But the one that I want to talk about that's I think even more important and informative is the Higher Education Act of 1965. And this increased federal money given to universities and really began the program of creating federal aid that was given to the individual student through the universities and a variety of low interest loans. This program that some of you may be familiar with if you're getting subsidized loans or unsubsidized loans from the federal government at much lower rates than if you were having to get them privately to go to college. And this completely transformed the opportunity for middle class and lower class undergraduates to go to higher ed. Up to this point, unless you could qualify for a loan or your family could qualify for a loan from a private bank, you could not go to college, or your access to college was much less. And so up to about 1960, the overwhelming majority of people who went to college in the United States were people who were from the very wealthy classes, from the upper middle class, or the upper classes themselves, who could pay for the education themselves. And this completely transforms the ability of people from the middle classes and the lower middle classes and the lower and working classes to go and attempt to go to college, to get federal funding, to get low interest loans, to get a series of grants coming from the federal government and then implemented through the states. And I just cannot tell you how important this is to transitioning of the ability of students, particularly minority students and students of lower economic backgrounds, to go to college and to be able to attend higher education and attempt to complete higher education on some level, whether community college or all the way through undergrad or grad school as well. And what it begins is this transition away from federally funding the colleges. They used to give a series of amount of money per university, and the university would decide how to pare out the money. Now it becomes this idea of transitioning the federal government to giving money to individual students, and they look at your background. That's why you have to fill out the FAFSA, right? That federal award thing that you have to fill out every year to figure out how much your parents pay or how much you can pay for college. That really begins after this Higher Education Act of 1965. So just incredibly important, and many people, I know myself from my own background, that I would probably not have been able to afford undergrad when I was coming into college in the early 1990s if it had not been for some of the laws that had been passed at that point about 25 years earlier as a part of the Great Society. So very, very important part of the educational component to the Great Society itself. Very, very important. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. The Immigration Act of 1965, as a part of the Great Society, keeps this moving forward. Very important. The United States had, if you remember going back to our earlier parts of the class and some of the textbook reading that you've done, there was a big boom in immigration for the United States from the late 1880s forward. Lots of dramatic immigration, the various coasts and coming through the portals of immigration, the famous one on the East Coast being, Ellis Island and going past the Statue of Liberty and all that stuff, right? But then around 1920, there was a huge cut down and shutdown and the creation of a quota of how many people could immigrate per year to the United States, particularly of national origins. And I mentioned that when we were talking about World War II, that there was this quota of how many people from each country could come every year and how many people from each cultural background, including Jewish people that I was talking about in the context of them attempting to seek asylum at the end during the issues of Nazi Germany. And so this gets readjusted in 1965 as a part of the Great Society. And the Immigration Act of 65 limited immigration at that point to 170,000 people per year. So it was not opening up the borders completely. It said basically there could be 170,000 legal immigrants to the United States every year. But It got rid of the national origin system, which gave preference to immigrants, particularly from Northern Europe, and allowed for very large amounts of immigrants coming from different parts of Europe, from parts of Asia, from parts of Africa. And this completely transforms the way the United States looks demographically. This opening up, this particularly allows for immigration from parts of Asia and some parts of Africa, most parts of Africa as well. And it just completely transforms the demographic and racial makeup of the United States because of this shifting away from this preference for immigrants from Northern Europe, who were almost all Caucasian. And it transforms the way that the United States' demographics look and continue to transform in the last 50 years as a part of the Great Society. Okay, so we have that. And then we also have a couple of artistic programs that are important. The NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities. Both of these programs have been targeted in the last 20 years by certain presidents who thought there was too much funding of them. But they were started by Johnson in the fall of 1965, gave federal funding for arts and humanities programs for the very first time. The lobbying for this had begun in the Kennedy administration, and it continues forward into the Johnson administration. And this legislation is important for setting up these two groups, the NEA and the NEH. Didn't have a ton of money that went into it at the beginning, but it was important for creating these two separate agencies that existed for supporting the arts and giving money to artists and giving money to people to study the humanities, particularly scholars and other people and independent scholars who could apply for grants and scholarships through the National Endowment for the Humanities. Interestingly, Johnson started the program in the Great Society era, but Nixon, the next president, actually expanded it dramatically. Really put tremendous amount of funding into the NEA and the NEH coming into the 1970s. And then it wasn't until we actually got into George W. Bush's presidency that they began to slash the budget for the NEA and the NEH. And so it's been a little bit of a difficulty for those two agencies to continue in the last 20 years, but they have survived, at least so far. Okay, and that gets us to the last of the programs, which is that I'm going to talk about. Of course, there were more than the ones that we're speaking of here, and it's the Voting Rights Act of 1964 into 1965. This has been called the most important law that's been passed in the last 100 years of American history. And what it does is it finally finishes, at least legally, not culturally, but legally, finishes off some of the vestiges of the post-Reconstruction period by eliminating officially on a federal level the local black codes and Jim Crow laws that developed in the period during Reconstruction, when Reconstruction failed, which we talked about earlier in the term, back towards the beginning. And it was signed into law by President Johnson. All sorts of advisors on it. MLK had been important. Some of his activism in the late 50s and early 60s, and the helping sort of organize registration of African Americans to vote. All these things being pushed through. And what it does, of course, is it provided federal protection to African Americans and in all races, but particularly focusing on the ways that African Americans have been prejudiced against up to this particular point. Official federal protection in terms of the access to voting, in terms of access to housing, in terms of access to all sorts of different programs. And it is the work of Reconstruction legally coming through to fruition, coming forward in the middle of the civil rights period, in the middle of the really strong civil rights era of the 1960s. And so it brings forward, obviously, the idea that now everyone can theoretically have access to, you can't be fired because of your race. You can't be fired. You can't not vote or have access to voting through some obscure code or some obscure test or something like that. But it does bring up, of course, the idea that just because you have rights that are subscribed to in law does not mean that there is no prejudice left, that there is no discrimination left, that there is not cultural residue of some of the really complex issues that the United States has been grappling with and continues to grapple with, right? So all these issues come forward in the Great Society. It's a significant increase in federal spending, But what's interesting at the same time was that Johnson, and you might think, oh, Johnson's this big liberal, which he was politically, and he was going to be raising taxes and doing all these things that liberals do to pay for these programs. But he also managed to win a passage of a $12 billion tax cut in the mid 1960s. And what that did was it actually increased the federal deficit for a period of time, but eventually economic growth of the late 1960s and the early 1970s made up for some of that revenue that was lost. And so all these major issues come about of the Great Society. This is an example of the federal government attempting to create change, attempting to create laws. And we saw this in FDR's time in the 1930s and 40s. For the New Deal, and we saw it back in the progressive era, particularly with Theodore Roosevelt, with Teddy Roosevelt, and to a lesser degree with Wilson and Taft, the presidents that followed Theodore Roosevelt. And so this brings up these concerns about the role of the government. How is the government going to be doing expenditure? These larger sets of issues. And there's all sorts of discussions about this. But the one thing that we can say, if we look at the Great Society in terms of the issues related to poverty and issues related to economic fragility, that the percentage of people who actually were below the poverty line in 1960 in the United States was 1 out of 5. The 20% of Americans in 1960 were either at or below the poverty line, very, very economically fragile state. And by 1970, a decade later, at the end of the Great Society, through the terms of Lyndon Baines Johnson of LBJ as president, that number had gone down to 12%. And so on some levels, the Great Society was a part of that diminishing of the large levels of economic insecurity and of levels of poverty that many Americans were facing. It's not the only reason why the issues of poverty got better and improved in the 1960s, but it is a part of that. And so it brings up this sort of continual sort of tension in the American federal government between what is the role of the federal government, and should the federal government actually subsidize programs? Should it be left to private enterprise? Should it be not interfered with on a larger level? This sort of laissez-faire, right, approach of the federal government, which some people support. And so this brings up these really serious issues, and they haven't gone away necessarily. We've had them more recently with issues related to Obamacare and discussion around that as well. But it is a big part of the story of the 1960s and this relatively activistic program that Johnson in his domestic policy pursued pretty well, pretty successfully. And you can see, of course, the picture here of him signing one of the laws into action as a part of the Great Society. And so it just really kind of brings forward this continued issue of the 20th century is what should the federal government be doing? And how is the federal government doing it, depending on who is actually in the White House and in the head of the executive branch during the period of time under discussion. All right, we'll stop there.